light for about 2 hours a day. And it had a particular impact on the practice. And I had lots of conversations with people who lived there. I was really fascinated by the experience of living in this very remote part of the country, which is itself a remote country. And the conversations focused really around their experience of that remoteness, but then also about the lack of light, the darkness, and mythology, local mythology. So that's an ongoing concern, really. One of which in Iceland is the mythology of the hidden people who are there sort of always in the background helping or not helping, as the case may be. And I was particularly struck by how prevalent this belief system was through the country. So thinking very much about how these people within this community were separated from the rest of the world, but then also very much connected to each other. So there was a very sort of bonded feel to the community. And again, this ever-present sense of mythology and folklore. I hope this image here isn't blocking out. Yes, it is. If I move it down there, that's better. So the writing of Lavinia Greenlaw has been particularly useful, and she has published or republished the diaries of William Morris, his travels through Iceland in the 1870s, which extremely beautiful poetic writing, and her writing in response to his diary entries as well. And she said, I'm as interested in the idea of a place as the place itself, and think the actual and the imagined versions are equally valid even after I have arrived. So again, that sense of layering. Let me see, this is probably the easier way of doing it. Now this is going to block. There, that's better. So just some research or some ongoing concerns really about different kinds of groups and where they might live and how they might function. Sealand is something that's been fascinating me for years, this self-proclaimed principality on an disused sea defence platform off the coast of Suffolk. So here we have the self-proclaimed king and queen of Sealand, and they have their own currency and their own passports. Also the writing of Alan Rowlands and his writing around different kinds of groupings in his 3 communiques. Long been fascinated by the island of St Kilda, a very obscure remote island that developed its own community over centuries and was evacuated in the 1930s. So very much living apart and had their own very particular customs and rituals. And I visited the Monsell Fort, which is off the North Kent coast a couple of years ago, which had a big impact on the research as well. So again, these were sea defence platforms where people were stationed for weeks on end. So this work was in some ways a precursor to what I did with Hugo in Leicester. This is part of the Fig 2 cycle. So you may have been aware of Fig 1 as well, which was a curatorial incentive, and Fig 2 followed on from that. The invitation was to produce an exhibition that lasted for a week. So I was part of that at the ISA in London. And I took text directly from some of these conversations I talked about earlier in Iceland, as well as other sources, including William Morris. This is just a bit of an example about how some of those texts became text that was used directly in the performances themselves. So the Magic Lantern, performers and audience were in complete darkness, and this is something I've been developing for a long time. I had a long ongoing interest in the Magic Lantern. I first encountered it when I was invited to produce an exhibition and performance at the Swedenborg Society in London, and I encountered there accidentally members of the Magic Lantern Society and joined the society and have sort of forged a friendship with them ever since. There's something about the lantern itself and its ability to invite participation that I'm particularly interested in and connect the audience to a particular kind of gathering. And I think this gathering itself instills a sense of belonging. So these are just some experiments I was doing at the time. So for me, there's something about the analog nature of the lantern itself. For me, the digital is almost completely incomprehensible. I've got no idea what's happening inside my computer, but the lantern I can understand to a certain extent. I can see light being projected through a slide. And there's an interesting paradox there for me, that this simple analog mechanism instills a sense of wonder. And I think it's about us being part of the experience and sort of buying into it. So in other words, the viewer, I think, can suspend disbelief and engage their imagination. So very, very different in some ways to the pre-recorded nature of cinema. And for me, I think the creative act then takes place live with the audience, again, encouraging this sense of participation. And it was one of the first times I was really able to use extensive archives. So these were personal archives from some of these friends, members of the Magic Lantern Society. So this durational event, vast as the dark of night and as the light of day, was commissioned by the Whitstable Biennale. And it was an invitation really for people to go on a trip out to sea. It was actually to the Thames estuary, but it was hard to tell when you were out there. As with a lot of performances, there's a sense of performers and audience being mixed together. When you boarded the boat, you didn't know who was a performer or who was audience members. So went out to sea on this boat, and at a certain point in the journey, you were invited to go below deck and witness a very intimate sort of performance using a magic lantern. And so there was a sense of what happened in the magic lantern performance mirroring a physical journey of the boat, of leaving and coming back. Again, I was really interested in how a sense of togetherness could be achieved by this grouping together, this very intimate experience of the people on the boat. Okay, so I guess one thing I'm also interested in really is ways in which we live together and cohabit and communicate. I'm interested in the idea of a temporary coming together or a temporary community, an experimental way of living. And for me, I find that particularly exciting because it's about the propositional, it's about the sense of what if. It could also be seen as a sort of rehearsal, I suppose, for an alternative future. I'm very aware of there being a critical element to this sense of community. This isn't always a positive thing, and I'm very open to that possibility. The idea that there's a question around the desirability of the utopian project, maybe even an oscillation or a push and pull, a sense of belonging and not belonging. And for me, that seems particularly important at the moment. And I've been very aware of how this work has developed alongside this rise in global nationalism, and maybe also in contrast or in at the same time as the pandemic and the various effects of that and how that's impacted on how we relate to each other and how we feel about ourselves as individuals in relation to the group. So the next two works I'm going to mention, It Grows Like a Strange Flower and From the Ground to the Sun, both develop physical structures in public spaces. So this is on an island on the River Don in Sheffield. And both works interacted directly with visitors and the local community. And there was a really important element, I suppose, of the works developing their own agency. There's an element of chance, encounters, and spontaneity to how the people who participated interacted with the projects. I was very interested in the possibility of the work going beyond my original intentions, of me proposing something, but then the work developing into something else as well. I think this is quite a good example of that, of how the group finished the construction of the dome using branches from the island. This is something that wasn't part of the original plan, but something that was quite exciting for me when the group developed its autonomy. And this is the group eating a meal of locally foraged food, and the group slept in the dome overnight. So the Geodesic Dome has been really important, thinking about its historical references, the work of Buckminster Fuller and Drop City, the alternative hippie community in America, both of which have a particular emphasis really on sustainability. So it was important to invite a diverse range of people to participate, both local residents and other people, and to encourage discussions as well. So really thinking about that relationship between community, participation, and site specificity, and how the co-production of the work could be fulfilled by the people taking part. These are some more references that I've been thinking about in relation to some of these ideas. So that really expand upon ideas around citizenship and collectivity and the individual. So crackers, the mass ornament, ideas around nationality, Benedict Anderson, the nature of human cooperation, Richard Sennett's Together, and personal identity in relation to community, Agamben's The Coming Community. So the other work I mentioned, From the Ground to the Sun, was a more ambitious version really, and shifted the site to the heart of an existing community, this time in a social housing project in London. So using 5 temporary reusable domes. And again, this work interacted directly, both with visitors and the local community, and inviting them to complete the dome's construction. We worked with an architectural practice to achieve this. I was very aware of ideas around engagement and estrangement. So thinking about how, in a way, a community could develop organically throughout the course of these works. So I guess it's about forging a link between an idealized sense of community, something that might be imagined, and also specific actual communities that exist in the world, and how the two could come together and be explored within the practice. So again, thinking about a layering, the bringing together of the physical and the imaginary. And that was further explored in this exhibition, The Part versus the Whole, which was at the University of Liverpool. And this was commissioned by Rose Lejeune. And this links very directly to the exhibition I did with Hugo in 2018 in Leicester. And both exhibitions responded very directly to the physical sites of the galleries, including their architecture and the history of the locality, by inventing fictional lost communities that used to inhabit those sites. And the cities themselves played an important part. So Liverpool, both Liverpool and Leicester, I think, have histories of multiple overlaid communities and cultural appropriation. And the idea that, I guess, the physical built landscape of the city can mirror this history of change, so the idea of urban morphology. I worked with writers both in Liverpool and in Leicester, so Rod Duncan, I've been working with extensively, who is based in Leicester, to develop these fictional narratives, thinking very much about the idea of the palimpsest, so the idea of something being reused or altered, but still bearing visible traces of its earlier form. So again, this layering process. In Liverpool, I was invited to work with the archives and collections of the university, which were incredible and diverse. And I wanted to use those to create visual and conceptual links between the artifacts themselves, the stories and histories of invented and real communities, the history of the city and the city's architecture. So I was really interested in creating new typologies between these disparate elements and forming an alternative history, revealing these underlying lost narratives. So performance as well. The performance in this particular instance involved, I guess, a sense of embodying this lost community and how they might use the gallery space itself. So it's this, it's a beautiful mid-Victorian building, and the performers and the audience moved through the building from the ground floor up to the top floor. There's something for me about how the choreographic and the rhythmic can be used to construct a sense of community. Thinking very much about dance and choreographed movement are being similar to the constructed movements of ritual. So these are just, again, some examples of references. The kindred of the Kibbo Kift, a sort of alternative to the Boy Scouts and Girl Guide movements that developed in the 1920s, who very much sort of homemade costumes and home sort of self-invented identity, really. So thinking about the particular campus location of these two exhibitions at De Montfort University and also Liverpool University, thinking about how universities encourage students to be both free thinkers and part of the student body. So again, this paradox of belonging and not belonging, of being together and separate, and how those ideas could be played out physically in performance works. Laban's movement choirs have fascinated me, and the way in which he structures group movement. Tricia Brown's Accumulation series, the relatively obscure work by Felix Ruckert, his Ring in particular, and some non-art references including Gurdjieff's Movement series and the educational work of Rudolf Steiner and his Eurythmy. So back to Leicester, and I was in the city carrying out research. It was a bit of a revelatory moment for me when I went into the Richard III visitor centre, and there was this fantastic part of the museum where you can stand on a glass floor and look down, and there below you is the site where Richard III's body was discovered. So thinking very much about the previous histories and identities of the cities, and this layering process really being revealed in this way. And I found this image in one of the spaces within the university about how the site itself, where the university now stands, has been overlaid by different communities over time. So the gallery itself is glass fronted on several sides. I really wanted to use that space to connect to the outside, and thinking very much about how this fictional lost community that was being developed could inhabit the space, could inhabit this new building. So another important collaboration was with the costume designer Jo Cope, who's also based locally in Leicester. And we worked together for a long time, and she produced clothing for members of the group. And they transformed within the space from these suspended fabrics that looked like banners, or they could even look like flags, into costumes. So performers and singers entered the space from outside, and then the performers were dressed by the singers, and then they led them into a back space. So this is a detail of some of these costumes. And we saw some of the material from local shops. Some of these sections of the costumes are from carpets, for example. And this is the moment when the performers were dressed by the singers. I was very interested in a rhythm within the performance, shifting from individual to collective, and that was echoed in the singing itself, which shifted from solo to choral. And as a climax, the performance culminated in a climax where there was a coming together of the group and also the audience members themselves. And this really interesting narrative that Rod Duncan developed about this fictional group. So thinking very much about the industrial heritage of the city of Leicester and its links to the garment industry. So there was a lot of that was thought through in the writing and in the design of the costumes. So there was a moment really in the performance when pieces of fabric were taken out, and there was a sense of these strands of fabric binding together the performers themselves. And that's something Rod wrote about in his fictional narrative about this group as well, that they use fabric to literally bind people together as a sort of healing ritual to bring members of the community together. So this is the moment when the group led everybody into the back room where the magic lantern projector was. So there's something very sort of heated about this moment of coming together. Also worked with photographic archives from the university. So these are just some examples of those, again, suggesting how we could imagine this group existing. And also objects as well. So there were various objects which have been excavated locally, and I had these refabricated. So these were positioned around the gallery space. So there's a suggestion that these could be associated with the group in some form or other. So now I'm going to play you a clip from the video of the performance. There and stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a fascinating oversight and interesting, because I've been working with you for a couple of years now, and there's elements that I'm unaware of. So the boat piece, the Whitstable, I didn't know about that. That's really interesting in terms of kind of physical journey mirroring what's going on inside. The practice, and the way we're talking about the practice today, to say so, I'm framing through this idea of universe creation and around storytelling and the use of fiction. So I guess I'm going to start with a question that seems to me really significant in terms of the practice, where you deep dive into these kind of site-specific research areas, and rather than creating historical narratives that emerge from that, you create these kind of parafictional narratives, that they are at some level fictional, and you work with and commission narratives which are fictional, but they're rooted in some kind of historical sensibility. And really interesting that you're working with Rod Duncan, who also writes alternative histories of Leicester through his novels. So there's this really particular interest in this idea of an interface between what we think of as fiction, what we think of as storytelling, and what we think of as history and archaeology. So I guess, and I'd also kind of suggest the objects that you've shown, it's worth mentioning that those objects are refabrications, and they're not straight refabrications, they're refabrications of objects within the museum's collection in Leicester, which have then been recalibrated slightly, so that they bear some symbolism which talks back to the kind of the fiction that you're creating. So I guess I'm really interested in maybe unpacking some of the ways in which what the use of fiction allows you to do that straight archaeology or history and presentation wouldn't allow you to do.
I suppose one way of answering that is just thinking about I suppose a sense of openness in the practice and in the process, and in how people might think about or understand what they're looking at. And I suppose on there are various things to do with display practices that I've become interested in, but I'm not necessarily interested in mimicking those or mirroring those. I'm not interested in, say, presenting a fictional museum or something like that. Yeah, thinking about those objects is a good example, and in a way, there's something almost accidental about this fabrication of them. That for the show in Liverpool, there are various objects that I probably naively wanted to show. There were these kind of priceless Egyptian artifacts, and it wasn't possible to show them. So I thought, well, I want to show them anyway, so I'm going to fabricate them. And I had them made so they looked very, very similar to the original. And I guess you wouldn't necessarily know that looking at them. You would certainly know that if you tried to pick them up, because they're made of polystyrene. So they were placed near some and on furniture from the museum's collection, but then we also, there was more furniture that I wanted, so I went to a second-hand furniture shop in Liverpool and bought some stuff, and that was placed alongside these sort of supposedly valuable antiques from the university's collection. And I was kind of interested in, again, this is a sort of not exactly accidental, but it's a sort of a part of the process of, I guess, research and practice coming together. And it added another layer to the work, I think, this sense of fiction and fact being combined in that way, in a very direct way. And then there was something about how, through that process, putting these things next to each other, I could start inventing my own connection. So again, this sense of an invented typology, and thinking about, you know, if there was a symbol that I found engraved in a chair, I found a slide or something else that I could put next to it, and you could start inventing your own stories by putting these things together. Thinking a little bit about somewhere like the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, where they have these objects put together, and it's got nothing to do with where they're from or when they were produced or when they were found, but it's simply about how they might look or how they might function together within this glass case. Yeah, so I think it sort of happened organically, really, throughout the last few years of thinking about that coming together. And again, but I think that layering process is something that's been going on for quite a long time, really. I mean, in some of my previous works, working with, quite a good example is actually working with I worked with spiritualists quite a lot. And on residency in Canada, I worked with a spiritualist who was talking very much about how she could see things, spirits existing in the landscape around us. And I had my video camera and I was videoing the landscape and saying that I couldn't see them, but I wasn't closed to the possibility of them being there. I wasn't trying to disprove what she was seeing in any way. So the effect was really this video of nothing, or of the landscape, and her voice saying what she could see there. And who's to say what's fictional in that and what's real, you know? And I think so again, it could be a matter of belief, really, and how it's presented to the viewer, how it could be interpreted by the viewer.
So that idea of a kind of a very porous border between fictions and fictioning and archaeologies and histories is important in the practice. And I guess it's really interesting to see it kind of as a set of developing structures or systems. I'm really interested in this idea of kind of typologies and the way that the practice creates new typologies. And I think for me, I guess looking at the Liverpool show, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think so that the reproductions in the Liverpool show are kind of pretty direct reproductions, whereas for the project you did for us, a couple of the reproductions you'd amended. So you'd added in, there was a sign on them, so they became more integrated into the fiction than they otherwise would have been.
Exactly, yes. So for some of those, exactly, I think one of the last images I showed just now, there was a symbol of a sort of star or a cross engraved into the forehead of that head that was lying on one of these tables. And this symbol was also mirrored in another object that I found, and then again in the actual layout of the performance itself, and this interlacing of fabric that I mentioned just now in the talk. So yes, there's another sense of layering there, I think, and so I suppose playing with some of those ideas about museum practices and how we might engage with them, and how there's a language there that we're familiar with and we might start believing in them. But I think it's also about suspension of disbelief, I think, about sort of being part of that construct and knowing it's a construct rather than just trying to fool people.
And there's something joyous about that, isn't there? I mean, kind of there's something escapist about it. The kind of the magic lantern is a moment of almost complete immersion for the audience.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful. And kind of moving on from that, I guess I'm really then interested in this gap that exists between kind of a sort of a fictional object which you've created and a kind of a real object. But I'm then also really interested in this kind of gaps that exist between, and how porous these gaps are, between a fictional community that you kind of create with your collaborators and a real community that's kind of developing. So I think we talked before about that relationship where you've had these community-facing projects which build real-world communities with no kind of fictional underpinning to them, or no clear kind of fictional underpinning to them. And then actually this kind of really interesting process where you're generating this kind of fictional community. And sorry, it's the Wayfarers, isn't it? It's the name of the group.
Yes.
The Wayfarers. But actually coming out of that is kind of parasitic on a real community that starts to develop around the project and the program, and you're kind of really generously kind of collaborative process that you use. So I guess then I'm going to ask then for you maybe to talk a little bit about that idea of these kind of fictional communities and real communities and cohorts kind of participating in the practice, and how they all interrelate, if you could a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's that I think this sense of a collaborative community is something that has emerged. It's become stronger and stronger, really. And I think as the projects have become more complex, that sense of that group has become inevitably bigger and more important. You know, I suppose going back to the first performance works I've done, that's felt like a sense of collaboration rather than me directing people. It's very much about how we can work together to figure this thing out and establish things often through improvisation. You know, for example, working collaboratively with Wiccan witches for a performance I did at the Barbican felt like one of the first times I'd managed to do that. So there was, and then I think, then looking back at the last two projects we've mentioned, so the one in Liverpool and your exhibition in Leicester. So, you know, it's partly about the resources available and the nature of the invitation. You know, something for me extremely exciting about being invited to interact with the sort of multifarious body that is a university and everything it encompasses. And, you know, so what happens if I then go and have a conversation with people in archaeology or in architecture, and how does that develop aspects of what I'm doing? And I think you're right, that as that has progressed, there's then been a sense of, well, this is another group, this is another community. And I suppose it's a community of shared knowledge and shared interest. It's also a community that is working together to develop a fiction, to develop this community that doesn't exist. So we're sort of using our collectivity to develop another form of collectivity, I think. So often there are different strands that these collaborators might feed into. So for example, working with, at the moment on a separate project, I'm working with fashion students within a university, and then also dance students and other people as well, interior design students, to develop different facets of this group. So for me, they seem to all sort of coexist somehow. This fictional group, this real life group, and then the communities that exist within the world anyway, within the locality in particular. So in Leicester, you know, it's very much about engaging with people who were or still are connected to its lost heritage. And there's something I find interesting about that, and quite poignant about that sense of a lost past that a city might, that you might be able to explore through talking to people. So I've been working with a group in Leicester as part of the research for this next phase of the project, who are connected to that part of the city's lost heritage. And so I'm hoping to go with them and to the museum collections within the city and look at some of these objects from the industrial heritage of the city and have conversations around those. So thinking again about the sort of real aspects of what we're looking at. But then I think, a lot of things about stories are that they are obviously subjective and not necessarily made up, but are filtered in a very particular way. And I guess the most direct example of that is employing or working with somebody like Rod, who is producing these things through his own imagination and through his own connection to the city and his interpretation of what I'm talking about and his experiences of living here, living there.
So I guess I'm really interested in, if we think about some models of kind of universe creation or world creation, and actually Rod's novels are quite a good example of this, where there's a set of shared histories and laws that define or shape what that universe looks like, and you can tell if something's a part of it because it adheres to those laws and that history. And I think there's something really interesting about the kind of the process that you go through, and we've talked about this in terms of this project, because this, I think, is the first time you've taken a piece of work which you've then revisited to kind of enrich that sort of that history and that law, but that actually it's quite tonal. So the kind of the rules of the wayfarers aren't written down. There aren't clear laws. It's about how it kind of interrelates and overlaps, and it's a very open model of universe creation and storytelling. And I think I'm also really interested in kind of the way it takes on and creates its own aesthetic and its identity. And I think there's something fascinating about kind of, so Rod's novels are Rod can correct me if I'm wrong in this in the comments, but I think they're set in, if I remember rightly, sort of a 19th century steampunk kind of environment. And actually a lot of your practice, Ben, particularly in museums, has a tendency to talk to that 19th century model of museums practice. There's kind of an interesting aesthetic correlation there, where someone like Jo Cope's practice feels quite different if you see her work to your model of practice, but actually is integrated really beautifully into the exhibition and the performances. So I guess I'm kind of interested in where the edges of the kind of the world you create are, what kind of, and how that's articulated to the kind of the collaborators. So I think I've just got one last thing, and I'm going to hand back across to you, but I'm really also we talked about before, and I'm not sure if this is something that would happen, but we've kind of used the terminology kind of operatic to describe your practice, because it's kind of got all these different components which are brought together to articulate a particular experience for the audience and the participants. But building out of that is an idea that that people can kind of share or be drawn into that experience. They can elect to have their own level of engagement with it, and I find that kind of a really appealing point of access for audiences.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes, just coming back to what you're saying about the nature of the collaborations. I mean, again, Rod might come in the comment on this, but I've had these amazing, fascinating, quite long conversations with Rod, and in some ways it can be quite frustrating, I think, for both of us, because I've got this idea of what I want, what I think I want, and he has his practice. So how do these two things come together? And we have different ways of working. And I want a sort of an openness to the experience when people encounter the work. And there's something different about the way inevitably Rod works as a novelist. And I think those conversations are such an important part of the practice. It's research, but it's also the work itself, that dialogue. And again, I have a different kind of conversation with Joe Cope, the costume designer, as well. So those kind of exploratory processes are extremely important. But you're also talking about how people might engage with the work. I think there's an invitation for the audience to do that. And I spoke in the presentation about ideas to do with participation and the magic lantern and the analog. And the invitation is certainly there. It's not, I'm very aware of not being directive and not sort of coercing people into doing something against their will. And there was a moment in the exhibition at Leicester Gallery in 2018 when I thought, oh God, are people actually going to do what I want them to do? Are they going to follow the performers into this back room and witness this extremely important part of the performance, or are they all just going to stand there? Because that could easily have happened. Luckily, they followed. But so I suppose it's about making that invitation enticing. And
yeah. So I think something. Sorry.
I suppose it's about a sense of autonomy or agency that the project can develop. That it has its own life in a way, its own existence that is beyond what I'm originally intended or even what I have thought about. So I think that's particularly important.
So I think that to me is what kind of ends up shaping how I think about universe creation, is that it's something which is produced, in your case, collaboratively between a group of you, and it's a set of tonalities and identities, but other people can run with it. And so what I was aiming at and lost when I was speaking last time was Will Welsford, the music director's idea of transcribing some of the music to play as standalone pieces in concerts. And I thought that was a really fascinating challenge to an artwork which is constituted as an experience.
Yeah.
But also really interesting in terms of understanding how elements kind of coexist. So Joe's costumes absolutely have the capacity to exist as Joe's costumes.
Yes.
As part of the project, but standalone. So that idea of kind of music, so the idea of stuff spinning off from it, which retains that kind of imprimatur of the Wayfarers or the everything, nothing human is strange to me, sorry. And which is the name of the project, I should say, to those who don't know. Yeah, so that kind of the spin-off model, I think, is really interesting in terms of your practice.
Yeah, and I think that's something that lots of people, lots of institutions have had to put stuff online recently because of the pandemic, which could be seen as a massive inconvenience. But we're trying to treat it with a positive spin, really, and thinking about how some of these encounters, these fragments, could be encountered online in a non-linear sense. And I've had various conversations with Rod about this, about how these fragments could be experienced. So yes, absolutely. So this is something we're developing, a sort of online platform before the official opening of the exhibition in January next year.
Because in the COVID era, everything has to have an online precursor.
It does, doesn't it?
But actually, I think it's a really powerful way of thinking about the project, and that idea of kind of fragments or elements that exist outside of that and how they're drawn together to become a part of that world that's created. I was going to say, it's 5 o'clock, more or less, and I promised that at this point people kind of come in with questions, and we actually have quite a lot of questions that have already come through. So if that was all right, Ben, I'm going to start putting some of the kind of the audience's responses to you. And I'm going to go more or less consecutively. So Rachel Graves has asked, have you looked much at ostracism in your research, and what happens when an individual fails to fit into the community? So when the gap between individual and community, I guess, expands rather than reducing.
Very much so. I think that was actually, in a way, where I started. And I had a very important residency, well, important for me, residency in Colombia, the country, not the university, in 2007. And I worked with various sort of occult groups and individuals, including a witch. And very much aware of her position as an ostracized member of society, but then also somebody who was very important to people. And there was a sense of me as an outsider coming from England, and how I might relate to these very particular belief systems that I had very little knowledge of or connection to, but try to immerse myself into. So I was very interested in a mirroring of these belief systems that I was encountering, and then my position in relation to those people would mirror their senses of being ostracized. An earlier example was a film I made, or a couple of films I made, of train spotters, and thinking about them as sort of existing in some ways in a marginal way of being, maybe they're ostracized, I don't know, but they kind of, I always see them as sort of operating on the fringes. You know, I stop at a train station, look out window, and there they are, sort of gathering around the edges of the platform. And there was an important realization for me when I was filming them on the station. I was kind of filming them surreptitiously and thinking, actually, what I'm doing is very similar to what they're doing. You know, I'm not part of their group, but I'm filming them, and in a way, to the outside, I might look like I'm a train spotter because I'm hanging around the train station with a camera. So again, I suppose that mirroring of something that exists in the world, and then my understanding of it, or my reworking of it. So yeah, that sense of ostracization is particularly important. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Hugo.
Muted. I've managed to not do that for an hour, so I'll take that. There's something really interesting about the way you've talked about invitation a few times over the duration of this conversation, and how that relates to ostracism. So for me, I'm going to bring this to a question that Adam Newman-Turner has asked. So Adam says he's fascinated by your earlier comment on belonging versus not belonging. Are you aware or interested in whether audience members experience installations as visitors, voyeurs, reporters, participants, intruders, community members? Does it matter? And then the same question around the singers and dancers. Do they co-construct, or are they just directed? And I think in some ways that's two questions. What I wanted to kind of talk to was that idea of, there's a layered invitation for the audience, and this seems to me really powerful in the work. So there's an artist called Mungo Thompson, who's kind of an LA-based kind of Californian conceptualist, and he produced lots of works which are inflatables. The one we held for a while was called Sky Space Bounce House. So it's a version of James Turrell concrete Sky Space, but it's an inflatable. And he used this phrase, which I find incredibly useful, which was, there's loads of art historical meat to chew on if you want to in my work, or you can just bounce on it. And I really like that as a kind of a way of understanding different points of entry to artworks. And that, his was pretty binary, bouncing or conceptual practice. But I think you offer that a similar kind of range of ways in for audiences, that you can come in and be excited about the wonder of the magic lantern or the dance, or you can really engage quite deeply with this kind of history that's being created, and you can treat it as a kind of a piece of archaeology, or you can treat it as a piece of fiction, and it allows you all of those different ways in. So I'm really interested in that idea of invitation and the kind of the generosity of that invitation towards the audiences. So building on that idea of kind of like ostracism, that I think kind of your work goes out of its way to create community that doesn't ostracize. And then if you could perhaps then respond to Adam's question around that idea of kind of, to what extent do you need the audience to engage in a particular way, or are you happy with them engaging on their own terms with the work?
Yeah, I think from, you know, a lot of my encounters with participatory practices, I've, you know, it's a tough thing to get people to engage or participate in a particular way, you know, and I think there's an invitation there. There's an open invitation, and I think I've experimented in lots of different ways about in what way can an audience or a group become part of this collective. I think that was my interest, really. Can that happen? It's an experiment, I think. And I think that, as I mentioned in the presentation, I've experimented a lot with, in fact, initially at the Swedenborg Society in their amazing hall where the performance took place, where I rearranged the seating into concentric circles, and that was based on my experience of going to a Quaker meeting where everybody sits in concentric circles and there's no one focal point. So there's a sense of unity, there's a leveling thing there. So audience members and performers are all seated amongst each other. You don't know who is who initially. So I think there's something about, you know, so rather than expecting an audience member to directly do something, I think just by the fact that they are there within this group, they're implicated in something. And for me, that sense of belonging is enough, and that's quite exciting for me. And I actually feel it myself, because often, you know, when it's performed, not necessarily during rehearsal, but the actual performance, I get a real sense of excitement of this group existing and coming into existence, I think. It's almost like the first time I've really seen them or really experienced them. There's a thrill for me about me being part of that group. I think, you know, I sit as an audience member, in other words, in the performances and see what it feels like to do that. I'm not saying that other people necessarily have that same experience or reaction, but I think I'm open to there being a range of different reactions, really. But I think there's something about the sort of enclosed nature of it, and often working in the dark with these lantern projections, that it's something that I think you, on quite a basic level, we can feel part of and relate to. You know, I mentioned in the presentation about the nature of the analog, and knowing how this thing is made allows you to engage with its magic in a very particular way. So yes, yeah. If that answers the question in some way.
I think it does. But I think there was a corollary question. There's another question from John I will ask in a second. But the second part of Adam's question was around a similar question, but for the participants. So for your kind of collaborators, and I guess it comes back to what rules are put in place or enforced to allow kind of coherence to come out of this kind of group working. And I think it's a really interesting process, because actually it's not necessarily, as you said, until the kind of the performance, it's not that you've got the costume designer and the music people and the choreographer and the magic lantern operators all together in the same room having conversations about how this develops. It's kind of you working with each of them in quite individual ways until that moment that it all draws together for the performance.
Yes. Yeah, which is an exciting part of the process for me. I think, I mean, in some ways that it varies, you know, that the choreographer and the composer I've been working with recently both know each other. So they have a sort of a history of working together. And I think that's been an important development about how the movement and the sung elements can be formed together. And in this other project I mentioned that I'm working on at the moment at Kingston University, there's a sense, really, of working with different subject areas within the university, of how these different collaborative groups might connect with each other. So how elements of what I'm working on for costume design might overlap with what I'm working on for the architecture of this structure that we're building. So I think increasingly they're becoming intertwined with each other this idea of a sort of an organic work as a whole feels exciting.
More intersection. I think that's kind of really interesting in terms of the way the practice develops. That the model of creating fictions looks more and more like the model of creating community in its communities, in community structures.
Yes, exactly. So it's how people might share ideas, how, and I think some of that is incidental and almost coincidental, actually. So that, you know, I think it goes back to that sense, those visual clues, that sort of exchange of symbols and images, you know, that I showed you for the exhibition in Liverpool. Thinking about, I found a tile from the wall of this Victorian building that had this particular pattern on, and how that could be repeated in other things. And bringing together, so if I bring together a fashion designer and somebody who's working in interior design from the university, and they take inspiration from each other, and so they might look at a shape or a symbol that the other group is using and use that in what they're doing, and it's taking it out of context and reusing it. And I think that's what sort of builds the structure of the group and of the community, in my mind at least. You know, that there again, it's about this typology, about this system of knowledge and of how things are interrelated. And I think it's about creating those new links that's something I find particularly exciting.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really interesting. So I've got a question and then a comment from Rod. A question from G. So the question, is your own presence factual within a project? So I think that's quite interesting in terms of to what extent does the role of the artist become kind of mythologized or fictionalized, or the author in the context of creating these worlds or experiences for people? And then I'm going to just... So if I've misinterpreted you, G, let me know, because he's then got an or. So your consideration of fictionalizing an individual autobiography being difficult versus the facility of blending into a curated fiction of a commune. So I think, is there a suggestion that kind of somehow the status of a fictional community is more straightforward to narrate or create than something which is a kind of an authentic autobiography? So I'm going to go with my kind of first interpretation of this, and G, let me know if I've got this wrong, which is this idea of kind of your status within the project, how much that kind of authorial control wants to be visible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm sometimes sort of tempted within the writing that is released about an exhibition to not even say that this is by me or it's not an artwork, but it is, you know, almost sort of extending the exhibition into the way in which extending the ideas behind the exhibition into the way in which it's presented to the world, you know, extending that fiction. So I suppose I guess there's a question around origin as well. In fact, the project I'm working on at Kingston is called The Origin. Where do these ideas come from? Where are they germinated? So yes, I think I don't know about mythologizing the role of the artist. Is not something I'm thinking about or intending. In fact, in some ways, you could argue it's undermining that idea of the artist as somebody who is the sole creator of something. There's something much more democratic or even more communal about the process of making that I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, I think that seems to me to make sense. So I'm going to, if other people have questions, if they want to drop them in now, there is still time. Otherwise, I am going to finish with a comment from Rod and a question I think that might emerge from that. So Rod said, I've been fascinated by the easy ambiguity achieved through the presentation of imagery, objects, movement, and the way that ambiguity pulled against the sharp specificity that was a tendency in my early writing on the project. So I think that's really interesting to think about, that kind of dynamic between delineating rules of a universe and kind of something which is more fluid than that. It seemed to me that the tension, sorry, this is Rod still, it seemed to me that the tension was really productive. Those conversations were an artwork in themselves. And actually, I think that's a really interesting point, which is how much the processes that sit behind this become part of the constituent experience of the artwork. So that with the work in Sheffield on the island, the construction and making of it is the artwork, that experience. Whereas I guess we still kind of slightly inhabit a world where we wouldn't necessarily think of the conversations between you and Rod as a part of the product, but actually there is something really useful about that being considered a part of the artistic experience, even if it's limited to just the two of you and it's not documented and recorded. That's a really powerful kind of moment. And more broadly, once it's kind of in those late rehearsals, that's really powerful. You've got 25, 30 people in the room who've never worked together. They're all in some way implicated, but they also function as audience. They have an experience of the process, which is really valuable. So I guess I'm going to finish with that. If other people don't have it, is kind of how important that kind of collaborator experience is to you, and where that sits in the kind of the constitution of the practice.
It's become an integral, essential part of the work now, really. So those conversations that Rod very rightly described as an artwork in themselves, in a way, Rod was talking about this sort of this tension in some ways between our different approaches. This sort of ambiguity, and then pulled against the specificity, as he said, as a tendency in his early writing. And that, that informs the work very directly, I think, between, shifting between these different positions that we spoke about. And I think I don't want the work to be pinnable, downable, or definable in that way as an experience, I think. So I think if the viewer feels a sense of ambiguity about their position, where they are in relation to this experience or in relation to this group, then that's a good thing. Because again, going back to the very first thing I said in the presentation, I think that's the sort of underlying foundation stone of a lot of the practice, is really that uncertainty and that sense of flux about where I am, where we all are in relation to each other, and how that shifts constantly backwards and forwards, being together and apart. So I think those kind of shifts in those tensions between different situations, different positions, in conversation with Rod, for example, would create an atmosphere or a way of thinking about or understanding the work itself.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Right. I'm going to say, if there are no other questions at this point, I'm probably going to draw this to a close. That's been fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben, for your time and the insight into the work. It's been lovely to talk to you about it.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Hugo. It's been great.
No, it's a pleasure. And thank you to everyone who's listened in through Zoom. We will look forward to seeing you in the real at some point in the future. Ben's project will be very early 21, so keep an eye on our website and social media, and we will let you know when it's happening, but early 21. We hope to see you all there.
In 3D.
In 3D. Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks, Hugo.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.